Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're so excited to welcome Sabia Wade in conversation with Jalessah Jackson for a discussion of birthing liberation, how reproductive justice can set us free. Birthing liberation presents reproductive justice as a pathway to equity in the birthplace of liberation. This event is co-hosted by Access Reproductive Care-Southeast. ARC Southeast is a reproductive justice organization based in Atlanta, Georgia, that funds abortion and builds power in the region. Sabia Wade, who uses she or they pronouns, is a radical, full-spectrum doula, reproductive justice advocate, equity consultant, and somatic educator based in Atlanta, Georgia. In 2017, she founded the nonprofit For the Village in San Diego, and in 2018, she founded Birthing Advocacy Doula Trainings, BADT. In 2021, she launched the Black Doula Podcast, and Essence Magazine listed her as one of the 9 Black doulas and midwives to follow now. Their work has been featured in Insider, The Advocate, Business Equality Magazine, Ebony, Motherly, Well and Good, and Healthline, among many outlets. She has appeared on several podcasts, including Evidence-Based Birth, Birthful, Happy as a Mother, and Birth Pains. We are very excited to have her here with Jalessah Jackson, Charis' friend, who is a Black queer mother and interdisciplinary cultural worker in Atlanta. They serve as the interim executive director of ARC Southeast, an abortion fund and reproductive justice organization serving 6 states in the South. As a reproductive justice practitioner, Jalessah is committed to the fullest development of oppressed people's collective power and self-determination, and their approach to building power is rooted in a people-centered human rights theory and practice. So we're thrilled to have everybody here physically with us, and also all of you watching virtually from around the world. So we want to let folks know you can ask questions virtually at any time. And for our folks who are here in the room with us, I'll be bringing a mic around so that you can ask questions when the time comes. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Jalessah to get this party started. Welcome to you both.
Okay, cool. Because you just never know.
I never know.
Is it good?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Welcome, folks. Really excited to join you this evening. And just congratulations. I think that's an appropriate place to start. Birthing Liberation had a birthday this week. You put your baby out into the world.
Yes.
And so how does that feel to kind of see that?
It feels like, like someone's, obviously I'm a doula, so someone's pregnant and you're incubating your baby, and then even after you have the baby for a while, like you don't really let nobody touch your baby, see your baby, all that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden they get to a point where they can actually start going out into public. And you're like, why are you touching my baby? But they're also scared at the same time. Like, do you have germs? Like, what's your thoughts? Like, all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of like the excitement around it being out there, but also some disorienting, like I have the book in my hand, but then I see pictures of the book in everybody else's hand, and I'm like, okay. And then people are reading it, and I'm like, okay. Like, so I'm just like anxious.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like that's real, because it's a labor of love to write a book, right? And so there's a layer of vulnerability that goes into putting pen to the page and then taking that step and sharing it with the world. So kudos to you for doing that.
Thank you.
And how appropriate for the first stop to be at Charis, a feminist bookstore, and we're here talking about reproductive justice. One of my favorite things to tell people about RJ is that it's rooted in Black feminism, right?
Yes.
And so just making that link, I also saw on Charis's social media this week a flyer that was sort of advertising an event that they would be having. And so just like reflecting on that sort of feminist responsiveness to issues that we're seeing. And I think we see that in the reproductive justice framework too.
Yes.
So if you could just share a little bit, like, why this book, why now? And maybe I'm, as a nerd, I'm always curious about, what the sort of process was like for you as you were sort of moving through writing it.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about the whole like people having the book and it being out in the world, I think it's the anxiousness comes from, yes, the actual words that are in the book, but I think it also comes from the energy behind the words as you're moving through life, right? Because it's a 2-year process. For me, it was a 2-year process. So, and it was a 2-year process during the pandemic. So it was like, I was really locked in, but I was also going through a lot of trauma, a lot of loss, losing my grandparents, losing my doula friend, losing like a lot of people in the mix. Having like, like a lot of Black businesses, including mine, like saw very much of a like increase, but also trying to handle that. So I see like all of that in the book, not just the words in the book. It's like the actual energy as I was like moving through life at the same time. And why the book? So initially when I first thought about writing a book, to be honest, I was like gonna play it small. I was like, I'm gonna get something, I'm gonna write a little, like, not little, but it was like, I'm gonna write something, I'm gonna self-publish, and I'm not gonna like, I guess I didn't see like the reach, if that makes sense. And then the pandemic, as unfortunate as it was a point of like seeing so much chaos and then also seeing so much community come together during that chaos. And then being in reproductive justice since 2015, I already had seen the principles of community in this and not when I really saw it. like during the pandemic and during this time that I was thinking about this book. And so with my like history as like a doula, a teacher, being in spaces with folks, going through my own stuff, it was like, for me, how do I find hope in all of this? Like, how do I find hope in, the statistics that I'm seeing and then further complications that was coming with the pandemic, and just all these things. And so I was like, let me put it into a book and see if anybody else kind of speaks to it. And I think going through the book, you start with like history and present day, and you talk about trauma, and you talk about all these pieces, but you also come to this space of like possible solution. And that was like not only the book's process, but my process. So it felt like, even honestly, when Roe was overturned, my editors came to me and they were like, you need to change the book, right? Because a lot of people had to change their book during that time.
Interesting.
It's wild, right? Like they were like writing about something, and then it was like, oh no, now you have to put a whole different spin on it, because now by the time your book gets out into the world, it's gonna be a different world. But the thing that was wild was like, I didn't have to change anything.
Yeah.
So it's just like a reflection of being timely, but also I think being timeless at the same time.
Yeah. And I think we would be remiss to not spend some time talking about what reproductive justice is, how it came to be, and its relationship to that timeless piece, I think, right? Like, you didn't have to change the book because you were talking about RJ.
Yeah.
Had you been talking about, I don't know, reproductive rights?
Yeah.
Right? You would probably have to respond to that historic event in a different way.
For sure.
But, and I think it speaks to the capaciousness of the framework, right? Like, it's 4 simple tenets, but the framework holds so much. And so if you could just, how do you define reproductive justice in the book? Right, that's kind of like the central theme as like the point at which we are able to create possibility and that collective liberation. So if we could just level it for everybody that's
For
joining.
sure. I think like exactly what you're saying. Like if I was talking about reproductive rights laws, which are very important things to talk about, I'm not the most qualified to talk about all the time. But for me, it was like talking about reproductive justice embodies the past, the present, and the future, because it's something that is everything, right? And I think reproductive justice also gives the ability for things to expand and for them to constrict, and for us to still be in the movement with the collective mission. So for me, it was like there never was, and I think it's why I'm in the work, is because it's ever evolving, right? Like it has these 4 tenets, it has these main ideas, but as the world shifts, it still stays true.
Right.
Right. And at some points, like obviously when we're talking about the issues and disparities in the world, things shift. Like a few years ago when I was coming into reproductive work, I mean, abortion was always on the table, right? But it wasn't on the table the way that it was in the last couple of years, right? But it was still reproductive justice, right? Like depending on what's going on, things are going to have more urgency or more front-facing times, and then some things are going to come back and they're going to come forward again. But it's still reproductive justice. So for me, writing the book was like, how do I keep that, not necessarily like make it so general that there's nothing to catch on to, but how do I keep it so that people can flow with what it is? And even like as a doula, I tell my doula, like, I'm a full spectrum doula, right? Because definitely I feel like an avenue that's connected to reproductive justice, obviously. But when we talk about full spectrum work, it's like you can start in birth and go to postpartum, and then you're in death work, and then you're over here, but it's always staying under that same framework.
Right.
So for me, it was like writing a book that keeps that in mind, but allows people not only to see the flow based on topics and where the world is going, but also the flow of themselves. Because even as like a reproductive person, you know, because we have conversations, like sometimes your capacity is this big, and you can handle all 10 topics that are happening in the world. And sometimes you're like, it's really low. Right. And all I can do is like read about it and turn over. So it's just like a book that honors that. While giving us direction, insight, and like hopefully sparking innovation into what the future of reproductive justice can look like.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think shout out to the founding mothers because they intentionally situate the framework in the human rights frame. Right? A framework that transcends the sort of limitations of legality, recognizing that particularly in the context of the United States, like the Constitution is very malleable, as we see, right? It ebbs and flows. It's flexible depending on what's at stake.
Yes.
But it's sort of sometimes geographically constrained, right? Like if we consider the abortion restrictions that exist here in Georgia at 6 weeks versus Florida at 15 weeks, right? So it's like very much contextual even, sorry. I talk my hands.
Me too. Like,
it's very contextual, right? Whereas, you know, RJ's situatedness in the human rights framework, I think allows for multiple entry points, like, you know, right? Like if you are not working as a doula, right? Or as a nurse, or an abortion fund, right? Like there's still a way for you to plug into reproductive justice work if you care about any issues that affects people's human rights.
For sure. And I think also too, like even with that in mind, like when I wrote the book, one of the things that was like important to me is like, yes, this is a book that parents can read for sure. But I also have like a big feelings around like putting the onus on Black and Indigenous folks. So like, here's how you do all things. Like, yes, here's how you do all things, and that's good for you to know, but it's all not your responsibility. So like, the book is written for everyone. I'm like, so if you have a baby, don't have a baby, if you don't plan on having children, if you're a doctor, if you're a nurse, if you're an engineer, like, doesn't matter who you are, to come into this space of reproductive justice, because I can guarantee that it's impacting you in 5,000 ways, even if you aren't the most aware.
Right.
And so it was important to me to like create a book that spoke to everyone.
Right.
And to some people more than others, but you know, to keep it open so that again, like you said, there's these entry points into reproductive justice. And I think it's the same way, like when you think about liberation, it's entry points into that as well.
Right.
So it's like starting where you are without having this like, and I think reproductive justice and the foundation of it is like you don't have to come into it one way. You don't have to do it one way. You don't have to stay in it in one way, but you need to be in it in some way.
Like it's really important to be a part of it. So please join us. Yes. And I think, I think it's written, like the tenets is, I think the intention behind being as clear as possible to allow people to kind of be able to say, yes, I believe that, right? You know, RJ says every individual has the human right to have a child and the options on, you know, the conditions under which they give birth, to not have a child, and, you know, accessible options for terminating an unwanted pregnancy. The right to raise our children in healthy and sustainable communities without the fear or threat of violence from individuals or the state. The right to sovereignty over our bodies, right? Bodily autonomy. And so most people will hear that and be like, yeah, I can get down with that, right? And I think, even the third tenet is my favorite because, when we think about raising healthy families, right? There's so many ways to do family. And safe and sustainable communities just speak to those intersections, right? Like, what does it mean? What does safety really truly mean?
I always talk to my students about that. Like, when
Right.
you talk about because I think when people think about reproductive justice, there's to have children, to not have children, it's like, okay, cool, I got it. But I always ask my students and folks that I'm in community with, like, when you think about safe and sustainable communities, what does that actually mean to you? And are you in one? Like, have you ever experienced that? And most people are like, nah, not really. And it's like, and also even the people who are saying that they haven't experienced that, they come from all different types of backgrounds, right? Because also, what's your perception of safety?
Exactly.
So it's like, I don't know, it just gives so much room to humanness.
Yeah, and I think it also illuminates the ways that there have been significant state failures, right? And so I love that there is the specificity of individuals, because we tend to individualize violence in our society, and we don't always think of the state as actually a violent apparatus, right?
Yes.
So I love that it connects the sort of individual and interpersonal to a more structural happening, right? And I think, speaking to getting at the root of things, I think it is the intention of RJ to kind of multi-pronged approach, but getting at the root causes
For
of
sure.
the issues.
I think when I was writing Birth and Liberation, one of the things, or even coming into this work, there's always we're fighting the man, and it's like, but my question always but who is that? Right? And then from there, I kind of started learning about different systems, like criminal justice system or education system, or all these things. And I'm like, okay, that also makes sense. But I'm like, but who are the people at the system, right? And where did they come from? But why do they have these opinions? And what influenced these things? And how do I get into understanding them more to understand why this system is flowing in ways, or why they're continuing to let it flow in ways, even when that is decreasing their ability to get to their liberation, which is wild to me.
What systems are you seeing? Where are you seeing that? Where it's are you saying their participation in it?
Yes. So simple one is the medical system,
right?
We look at, and I talk about obviously heavily in the book, if we look at the Black, disparities for childbirth and so on, it's 60% of those births could be decreased. They could not be there. We have the technology, we have the education, we have all the resources that we need, and it's not happening. And so when I look at that, I'm like, well, who are the people in these places? And why are they participating knowingly and unknowingly in this? But also, what aren't they understanding that if you are not creating safer places for Black folks and Indigenous folks, you're also hurting yourself. So where is that? For me, it's always been why don't you understand that?
Yeah, and I think RJ is kind of a responsiveness to that, what I call people's ideological underdevelopment, which is intentional, right? When we're talking about these problematic systems, it's all connected, right? The school system and the lack of quality education leads to, a widespread accepting of the status quo and unquestioning of it, and even belief in it sometimes, right?
Listen, the school system, you read Push Out?
You said what?
Push Out, the book?
Oh, yes.
Yes, and even understanding that as a Black woman, the criminalization of Black girls at 5 years old, just when they step into the school system, and then seeing how those things roll into our birth, our communities, our health, our well-being, our all these things. I'm okay, that was one of the first books that really brought a lot together for me around how these things connect and how they also are perpetuated, and why certain systems are built the way that they are, even in ways that you're not noticing. That, I don't know, I think very heavily about that, and I talk about that in the book too.
Yeah. And I like that you start in the room where it happens, and then the history of race and gynecology. Why was it important to begin there?
So the first chapter in the room where it happens, one of the things that I've realized in the work that I've done is like, everyone means well. We all doing work, like at least in the space that I'm in. Well, you know, it's a small space, but we need more people. But nonetheless, you know, like in that space, like we talk about statistics and we talk about, you know, how often Black virgin people are dying and how often Indigenous people are dying, but it like speaks about humans in such a numeric way. And I think sometimes like we just don't get that. Like our brains don't register what that actually means. So for me, I know one of the best ways that I've learned information and it's actually stuck with me is through storytelling. So I was like, well, why don't I start this with an actual story, right? And like, for me, writing that story about Rena was like, it was an accumulation. It wasn't like, oh, this is one specific person that I'm giving voice to. It was like, no, this is an accumulation of stories that I hear over and over and over and over. So when I put that story together, naturally it was like, how do I go from that story of present time, a present day situation, but relate that to history? Because we can't move forward without knowing our history. And so I was like, this is a great opportunity. like we're gonna start backwards and then go forward so that we can understand how Rena and her family got to that space and what impacted them. And so that people can start to connect the stories of like, oh, when this was happening in slavery times, oh, this is the mindset behind this. This is where this built up. This is why she wasn't cared for properly. This is why they were afraid of her partner. This is why her mom was having this experience, right? Versus like me just giving you statistics and you just moving on.
Right, like these are real people.
These are real people.
Absolutely. And I too, whenever I'm facilitating RJ trainings, I start with like a, you know, historically contextualizing some of the issues that we continue to see, right? I think it's important to continue to link and to also name like these are not new issues, right? Like they might be re-articulations, right? Like they might manifest in different ways because the enemy is savvy. It has to evolve and adapt with people, right? And for its own sustainability. And so I often like take time to ask people of like some historical examples of reproductive oppression, which is defined by the control and exploitations of people's bodies, their sexualities, their labor, and reproductive capacities, right? And so there's so many like moments, right, that we can identify in the history of the United States and around the world, right?
Yeah.
Where we've seen examples of reproductive oppression, whether it's forced sterilization, whether it's the separation of children and families, ICE detention centers, right? Like those are all the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Like those are all examples of reproductive oppression. And then the present day perspective, because that's actually how I have the conversation, and that's how you have it laid out in the book, right? And so it's like, I see what you're doing here, because I'm also doing it. Yes, I think it's important to do.
And it's important to like bring that present day space because you have to automatically, I feel like even like I asked you this question in the book, but I think as you read into that present day perspective, you're like, it don't sound too much different. Like, it doesn't sound too much different, right? Maybe it's dressed differently, right? Maybe there's a perception of choice, right? But like also you don't have much choice when you're without resource, right? So it's like it's important to link that historical context and understanding to the present day so that you have the ability to really see like, is this truly what I am being told that it is? Right? And like really ask that question for yourself of like, am I getting a perception of safety or this actually is safety? Right? Is this person actually free or are they given to resources to be perceived in a free way, right? So it's like asking those questions because how do you eat that different?
Right, exactly. Right, like I'm thinking about the long-acting reproductive contraceptives being disproportionately pushed to Black and Puerto Rican teens, right? During the time of like, healthcare reform and the pathologization of teen pregnancy, right? And we have those sort of historical examples. I even have a personal story around like coercive counseling after I had my first baby.
So much.
As a young Black
Mhm.
or single parent, right? Like being told what type of birth control to be on as opposed to being counseled about my options and like, reviewing my medical history to ensure that this is actually a good fit for me.
And also being told that is for one reason.
Right, for sure.
That it cannot be for it. You can probably do something else.
Exactly.
That doesn't put you in a space of controlling certain
Right,
parts of your body. That's not what you want.
Right, exactly. Right. Speaking of informed consent, right?
Yeah.
Like people need information, right? And so, and then I think about that relationship to what we see even on the global scale, where you have folks like the Gates Foundation that is marketing birth control specifically to places like Nigeria and in South Asia, right? And so we can kind of connect the dots even from like the personal to some of the things we see happening from a legislative perspective. One ways that there's incentive, like the incentivization of like coercive practices,
For sure.
right? And so, and RJ sort of speaks to that happening, right? So I was wondering if you can speak to it, like state the case for RJ as a pathway to collective liberation, right? And what does collective liberation mean to you, right? Because it's a word that a lot of people use.
It is.
In a lot of different ways.
In a lot of different ways.
How are you sort of trying to articulate it to the reader in this book?
Yes. So one thing to know about me is that like I'm pretty like realistic, and we've had conversations about like what is liberation and like what does that mean, and I think for me collective liberation is not this idea that all of us are going to just be like happy, skipping all over the place and whatever that may be. Because I think that all of us are in systems that require certain things of us, right? That like sometimes we just can't get away from. Bills need to be paid, things need to happen. But my goal is for how does everyone collectively help each other get to a more free place, right? So it's not about like this complete like you're skipping, you don't got no bills to pay, everything's great, It's like more so, how do I, with my personal liberation, help you get to a closer place in your liberation and whatever that looks like for you? And I think also with that, though, when we talk about the collective, one of the things that like bothers me is like in this space, especially as like an organizer, especially as like a person like that's heavily into the space, is that there also has to be a space for me to understand that your liberation may look different from mine. And in some ways, I may not like it, right? And I may not, always agree with it, right? But how do I handle that? So it's like without becoming like harmful to myself or harmful to my community. So how do I handle nuance, right? Like how do I handle difference, right? So for me, collective liberation is making space for everyone to be in a more free place, realistically, and also having the tools and the resources for when that discomfort comes up, when that hurt and that harm comes up, because we're not going to just go in this world not harming each other. I don't think we got to do it at this level that we're doing, right? But even in friendship, right? Like you could love someone and harm them. So it's like, how do we make space for that? And how do we deal with that with better systems in play to be respectful to that?
And what about RJ specifically, like lends itself to that possibility, right? Like, obviously, I believe in the framework because I work over here, child. And I'm always trying to help connect those dots for people, right? So like they can also see it. I think that's part of our job, right? To support folks in seeing it. Not just because I say it, but because they see it and deeply understand it as informed by what they see and understand. So what about RJ lends itself to that possibility for folks? And why not another framework like the reproductive rights framework, or why not another framework? Like what is it about RJ specifically that lends itself to that?
Yeah, I would say RJ because, and I've seen different frameworks and like been in community with people who have different frameworks, and there's many things that I can learn and definitely grasp and interact with from those frameworks. But for me, reproductive justice has been a framework that not only I've learned from like a logical standpoint, but it's been a framework that I've seen in action, right? And like in action, as I've seen it, it has been something for me that helps me to move towards my liberation, right? So for me, it's like, it may not be the answer for everyone. And that's also like part of my liberation is like, ain't my responsibility. Like if you, like, if it's not your way, you know, if this don't work for you, I hope you find a thing that does, right? But in ways that I've seen it interact in my life has been something that has been freeing for me, and also have seen it I've witnessed it free other people in their space, right? And I think that shows up in, you know, in actual spaces. Like, for example, like my organization, BABT, we have thousands of doulas from all over the world. They have different history, different like learning levels, right? Like some people come into our space, they don't know anything about queer and trans people. They don't know anything about a pronoun, like, right? But reproductive justice is setting the foundation of you can grow in this space, has allowed people to make mistakes and learn, right? And even just the ways of like, you know, fellow doulas and people that I'm in community with, the way they show up for me. Like, oh, you guys got something going on? I'm gonna leave this on your porch. You got something going on? I'm gonna do this, right? And so, and I've also seen it in the space of like disaster in the world, right? Like seeing how people show up when the pandemic was happening, and seeing how like, you know, I remember like, I think it was like some storm in Texas, and I remember like just people just showing up for other people and like utilizing mutual aid and being supportive, you know, as a full spectrum doula, being supportive when someone is having a baby or they're having an abortion and when a person is dying, right? Like that full spectrum. So for me, it's like reproductive justice has been a living example of how like when I step into it fresh, like, and I've like found my way into it, that's been something that has modeled liberation for me.
Yeah.
And it's not perfect.
Yeah.
It ain't perfect, as we know, right? But when I feel like people are aiming to do their best, it is something that can be felt and seen, and it grows. One person starts in one place, now they're doing something for the next person is now in the movement, and you're like, okay, I can see visually with my eyes and with my heart, like where reproductive justice can take us.
Yeah. I was at a meeting recently, and Dr. Lynn Roberts, who was one of the editors in, I think it was it, Radical Reproductive Justice, a collected, a collection of essays. Anyways, she said, we might not reach collective liberation in our lifetime, but we can have liberatory moments. And what you were describing about when you've seen people show up, when you've seen the like a divergence from individualism, for example, right? Because I think that's one of the themes that's like coming up for me as you were describing those examples, is like an intentional departure from individualism and towards the collective, right? And RJ, you know, is intentional in saying that, you know, the priority is to center the most marginalized, and recognizing that and meeting those material needs, that it makes possibilities for other folks, right?
Sure, and I think it's like also like coming away from that individual, right, and like into the collective. But I think one of the things that really has stuck out to me in my journey and the communities and things that I've been a part of is also like being collective, but also respecting individuality, right? Like I can be, because sometimes with some things I've seen where like there's this collective of like, well, we all have to be the same. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be like you. I want to be like me, but I want to be respected for who I am in the space that I'm in. And I mean like respected in obviously in my identities, and but also like my moods. Like I want to be respected for like, hey, like we talk about this, like I do a lot of things in the world and I like hope to make impacts in the things that I do. But I'm also very introverted. So I'm like, hey, I want to do the work, but I also want my community to let me like isolate and come back when I'm ready. And that's something that when I was in other spaces, I didn't have.
Yeah. And you mentioned the personal liberation piece, and I hadn't really thought about that. like what does personal liberation mean to you? And how do you see that in relationship to the collective piece? I think you started speaking to some of that, but what does it mean to be personally liberated? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so for me, it's the life that I live now, right? Like, I have bad days, I have, times where I'm like, what am I doing? But I mostly wake up every day feeling like I'm in my purpose. Like, I wake up feeling like I have I'm given a directive in my life. Not every day, like sometimes life happens, things happen, but I feel like I am in a space, and it's not just like my everyday work life. I am doing the work that I love. But I'm also like able to care for myself, and I'm able to be aware of when I'm in a bad mood, and I'm able to say it, right? And I'm able to be with it, and I'm able to, in a happy moment, be happy. And like as someone with chronic pain, I'm able to say, like, I'm in chronic pain, and I don't have to ignore it. Like, like I don't have to push back or like be less of myself. And that to me has been very much a space of personal liberation, as well as my ability to have safe spaces to like share who I am, share my ideas, share my disdain, like share all these things. And so for me, personal liberation has been my ability to be myself and to be a lot of myself. And prior to being a doula, and prior to before I became a prison birth project doula and all other stuff, I was in systems. I was in corporate America. Some of y'all probably still there, so I'm like, no shade. If you love it, I like it. But like that space for me was like the most like oppressed space I had ever been in. I was like, because I have to be less of myself to be acceptable here. And the only way that I can even advance to the next phase is by being less of myself. So the more disconnected I am, the better everyone else is. That's wild. So for me, my personal liberation also kind of like feels like the more of myself I am, the more my community benefits. And that's the space that I want to stay in, right? So for me, knowing that, I feel like in order for us to talk about collective liberation, or even like when we talk about healing, or we talk about helping our communities, and we talk about all this, is like, how can you do that if you haven't done it for yourself? Like, like when someone's speaking to you, whether it's like a therapist, a friend, whoever, and they're giving you advice, you have that feeling in your heart where you're like, you're just saying this and you know nothing about this, right? You're just saying this, but you do something completely different, right? And so I feel like in order for us to be talking about collective liberation, we have to actually feel it for ourselves, imagine it for ourselves, be aware for ourselves, like, where is my more free place? On a daily basis, I am interacting with these systems and maybe people that I don't want to interact with. How do I keep myself to myself, and how do I be more of myself throughout the day? Right? How do I not disconnect? And I think like our world's kind of set up in a way where we're constantly disconnected. And even like when Girl was worse, oh my God, me and Digi Mama, my kids find me, we had a whole conversation, and it was like, this is like a little example, but I'm gonna see if y'all vibe with it. So, because I was thinking about, mind you, I love like tech and apps and things like that, right? But I don't know why when that happened, I thought about how we use like all these apps to like track our like menstrual cycle, and it tells you like it starts to predict everything for you. So then like on a Tuesday, you're like, why am I craving chocolate, right? And it's like in the app, like, craving chocolate, whatever, right? And I just think about that on like kind of a liberation way of like, dang, you don't even know your body. Like you have this like app telling you when you're gonna bleed, what's gonna happen, how you're gonna feel, when you're gonna have this. And it's like, for me, liberation is being connected to self. But if you can't do that for yourself, how can you like speak that into your space?
Yeah, that's real. I think
and that's not no shade to people that use apps, because I get it. But it was something that like I just thought about.
Yeah, that's real. I'm like, I was a very grown adult when I learned how to like track it without any sort of technology. And I think that really speaks to the lack of comprehensive sex education that folks have access to. And so that's real. And then what you mentioned actually made me think about something that I've been thinking about a lot around just like the self piece. I think alongside taking care of yourself, and people who be around me are about to be like this girl, she always talking about this book she reading and what she read about and how it relates, but it do be related. Okay, and I'm giving you the spark notes because some of y'all will not pick up the let's be real. Okay. So at EARTH in February, we read 2 chapters from Sabia Wade, who was Black Panther and a political prisoner. And there is a chapter in there where she talks about like resolving contradictions. And saying you think about it when you're talking about the self, like the personal work, because she speaks to that in that chapter, right? She speaks about the importance of us, speaking of security and safety, the importance of us like taking an intentional departure from how we have historically conceived of that and root that in trust and how well we know ourselves, right? Our own personal limitations, how well we know the organizations that we are either part of, collaborating with, right? What are the organization's limitations? And that deep knowledge, right? Like that knowledge being one of the primary ways that we are able to maintain security. And I thought that was really interesting. And then in her like resolving contradictions, she talks about like practicing revolutionary criticism, and like that is inclusive of the self-criticism piece, right? And so whenever I talk about revolutionary criticism in RJ spaces, people get upset, child, they get upset.
But you have to know. But that to me is like, so I was talking to a couple people over the last like 2 days. I've been talking a lot for the last 2 days. But like we were talking, I was talking to like a student, a person, I don't know. But it was like this conversation around what if the worst thing happened, right? You know, all of us are like carrying this anxiety around, like, what if this happens? And that what if can be whatever it is, right? And one of the things that I like to guide people to do, and has helped me through my process of what if, is like, okay, what would you do if that happened? And then, yeah, think about it, what would you do? Right? And so for some people, it's like obviously triggering to be able to think about what would I do. But then there's also some type of freedom at the end of, this is what I would do, and this would be the plan if this worst thing happened. And I think when we talk about like our personal selves, we have to think about the worst part of ourselves too. Like we also think about our limitations because of those pieces, right? Or maybe not even the worst, but maybe the more difficult parts of yourself or the more limited parts of yourself that you don't always appreciate. Right? But it's like you have to talk about that in order to, especially in this specific type of work that we do, it's like if you want to get a mission accomplished, it can't be like I'm gonna do everything and be everything and say everything and every single thing's gonna be this. It's like, hey, my limitation is this, my knowledge base is this, my body works like this, my brain works like this, my literal brain works like that. Like, and so this is what I can do in the process of moving towards this collective goal in our organization, in my personal life, and whatever it is. And that to me is like liberating, right? To say, like, I can't do it all, but these are the pieces that I can do. And what can you do? Right? But it's like people don't want to have those conversations about liberation, about limits, about boundaries, around worst case scenarios, around the shadow parts of themselves. But it's like the more you talk about that and the more honest you are about that, the more you actually push forward with whatever you're in it to do.
Right. And I think, you know, I see these themes coming up in conversations in RG spaces all the time. And I think one of the areas where people struggle, right, is like, as someone who is leading an organization, as someone who is right now leading an organization, it's very easy for me to say, like, we gotta talk about it. Well, it's not always easy, actually. I really don't want to talk about it.
Exactly.
But it costs me a lot less to say that we need to talk about, you know.
Power dynamic.
Right, exactly. And so I also just want to name that, like, that there's a different level of responsibility for folks in positions of power to actually bring that, because the consequences are not the same. The cost isn't the same, rather. And yeah, so I was thinking about that alongside personal responsibility and in its relationship to unpacking trauma, because a lot of people come to this work, right? Sometimes folks are like, what's your origin story? And I have been in spaces where that question is followed by like a really traumatic event happening to someone, right?
A lot of times.
And that is the thing that sometimes catapult someone into this work. And then as we just think about, the sort of genealogy of reproductive justice since its inception in 1994, I've been in a deeply reflective space, after the overturn of Roe, especially just like, how did we get here, right? We've been asking this question, but like, how did we get here? Not for real, how did we get here? Right? Like, for real.
How do we get here?
Yeah. And so like, the personal responsibility piece, I think, related to the revolutionary criticism piece is a willingness to kind of be deeply reflective of the decisions that were made, the strategies that were deployed, and even perhaps some concessions that were taken that didn't need to be taken.
Yeah.
And why, right? Like,
but also starting at the point of like, a lot of people come into this work with a bunch of trauma.
right.
A bunch of trauma. A lot of people find this work because something terrible happened.
Right.
Right? And like, when I was becoming a doula, I was also going through some terrible stuff. It just happened at the same time, literally. And I'm like going to doctors and having fibroid surgeries and having complications and like still doing my work at PPP and like moving through, right? But also there had to be a period of time where there was a time where I paused because how much of my trauma was really coming into my work, but was it motivating my work in the bad way? You know what I mean? Like, how much of my trauma was I bleeding onto the people I was working with? How much of it wasn't really, like you said, when we talk about strategy, what was my strategy based in? Was it based in like what makes sense in the sense of like sustainability and mission and dividing the work, or was it really based on like me trying to fight my trauma and get to the end of it? Right. And I think like we have to think about that. And like in this smaller one-to-one interactions that we have based in RJ, but also in the systemic ways that we see RJ move.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes.
But that's why I wrote the book, right? Because I was like, every time I would go, so I've been in like, especially as a teacher, like in so many different spaces with so many different people from so many different walks of life who come into this space sometimes from the aspect like I have been hurt by this space or like in my reproductive, experience, or sometimes they come from a space of like, I want to do better because I came from the whitest of white families who are like the most racist people ever. And like that was traumatic for me because I don't believe in that, but I also don't know what I believe in yet.
Baby, I'm gonna need you to go find that out first.
Period. But a lot of my work, right, has been like me like telling people and giving them permission to go figure that out. And they're like, well, I want to get active in RJ. And I'm like, that's a way to be active. Go figure you out and then come back in this space. Right? Or get some tools, get some resources, get whatever, because I would much rather you come into it, unpacking your trauma, seeing where your limits lie, seeing what's going on with you, and then making like a very educated and informed choice about where you lie in this big mission. Right? Versus like just bleeding all your pain like and all your trauma all over everyone and impacting the work in a way that is not moving us forward.
That's real. And I think that's where that sort of the idea of like subjecting yourself to those criticisms, right? Like if they're not mechanisms of accountability. So that's one of the things that I find is difficult is that we do a lot of like speaking to healing in RJ and the importance of it and the recognition, right? Like we all recognize that there's a lot of trauma and that it impacts the work. And so like there will be like a verbal acceptance of that as a fact, right? And so I like the framing of it as a personal responsibility because even when we think about how Black feminism sort of like really articulated itself in like the ethic of care and the ethic of personal accountability, right? I think those are some of the pieces that I would like to see more of when we think about RJ as a practice, right? I like that. I like to think about it as a practice. Like how do we practice that? Because it hasn't really been practiced.
Yeah, and I think also too, like a part of that, like practicing RJ is like kind of a reframe around, or what I'm hoping is that like there's a reframe around like what the work is Because I think a lot of times people think of the work, they're like, oh, I have to be standing on the front line of this, or I have to be, taking 10 birth clients a month, or like that's the work. And it's like, but the work and the whole point of RJ is that it is very holistic, right? So the work has to include yourself at all times. Like, what is the work that you're doing on yourself? And sometimes that's going to be the only work that you're doing. And that's not a bad thing. Because I would rather you go do that work. Because we've all been in a space, for anybody who's been like an organizer for a while or whatever. Sometimes you go into space, and I know you can speak to this. It's like you go into a space and you're like, okay, we have this mission, this is the plan, we have the strategy, we have this thing. And it's like the one or two people that are so dysregulated because of their own trauma that you're like, we can't even like really move through because this whole space is about regulating you. Now this space has to kind of tiptoe around you and make you the focus so that we can even get through this conversation. And like, it's not a problem with you needing help or needing resource, but now we're not even moving to where we need to go. So like, how do we be humans and need each other, but also like make sure that the work includes us and that the work is not, the self-work is not because someone is like, bro, you came and messed up the whole meeting. You know what I mean? It's like you actually being able to take the time and be carried right by your community to take that time. Yeah. Which I don't think is always a piece. Like we say a lot of like, go take care of yourself. Community has to be a part of that care. For sure. What does it mean to take care of myself? Like if I have bills to pay, right? What does it mean if I have kids, right? Like and there's no one to take care of them, right? Like what does it mean to take care of myself if it's not part of the work in my community to help me do that? Right. But I'm supposed to come here and be on the front line and do 1,000 things and not be burned out. Well,
yeah, I think yes, and keep talking about different things, but that reminds me. Look, we have like a value, explicit value at ARC around self-care, right? And this value has existed since before I've been at the organization. I just want to name that. And I say that because there has been like a sort of like reappropriation of self-care, and you know how it goes in the West. It's now just like really just consumerism. Like, what can you buy to make yourself feel better about the fact that eggs are $10 Like, what the hell? You know what I'm saying? Like, what can you do? Right, like to and so so one of the conversations we've been having is like how we make self-care an actual possibility that takes an intentional departure from like the capitalist like machinations of what self-care is, right? And like how is that related to like how we be with one another? One of the things that we engaged was this theory of mutual comradeship, right, by Dr. Charis, where she is like reflecting on the Black radical tradition and how dispossessed communities were able to increase capacity to take care of one another by being deeply committed to their values, their principles, and being responsive to the needs that we see reflecting in community. And I think one of the like grievances or issues that I have with self-care is that it's so individualistic that it doesn't increase our collective capacity. And when our collective capacity is increased, then there's more space for me to take a nap. I take my nap and I know that the world is not crumbling, right? I know that Dartricia got it because we coordinated, right? And so like it's through the deep commitment to each other and relationship and our collective vision and those principles that we're able to like actually increase capacity collectively.
And I think also that like really like one of the feelings that I had, not everyone has to agree with me, so let's put that on the table. But like when I'm thinking about like things that happened with Roe, right? I was like, it took them 50 years to get that reversed, right? That's a long time in theory, like right? Like it's kind of a long time. But I was like, I thought about like the thing that I went back to outside of like this is gonna be terrible. Was like, I wonder what system of care they had in place for each other to make that happen. Like I wonder like how it was like, hey, you take care of yourself, we're doing this work, then we flip and then you do this. Like just wondering like as like terrible that it is, what like system of care did they have for themselves in order to get to that point? Does that make sense?
Did who have?
Like people that were opposing or like wanting that to happen.
People who are wanting Roe to be overturned?
Yes.
Like, how did they move that?
Yes.
Oh, that is.
I know. I know it's a lot, right? But I'm
Yeah.
talking about just on the sense of like care and for each other.
I think it was exploiting care from others.
True.
Right? Right, like the people who are writing legislation and like slowly chipping away at the like very little legal codes that we fit under as non-human humans.
Yeah.
Right? Like, let's be so for real. Like that ongoing, it's, you know, the ability to be able to think and respond because you're not constantly dodging
Life, like the things that are happening in life.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, that probably creates a little bit, my co-parent and I were literally just joking about, you know, people are not always like leaving the house and having to think about like the violence that can be enacted on the body. Like that probably allows you to do all sorts of different things with your brain space, right?
So,
And
in that sense, right? Like, because I think about this too. I was talking about that. Like, I'm Black. Like I mean, not Atlanta and like this space in Georgia is like it has its own things. But when I was living specifically in California, I was like, there's no one. Like, it's literally just me in a lot of spaces. And just noticing like how my nervous system was like always on. You know what I mean? Because I'm like, what's gonna happen today? What's white people going to do today? Like, you know, like what my progression am I gonna experience today? And that's part of me moving to Georgia, even though I was like, oh, Georgia's like, but anyways, with that though, like, I think part of community is and community care and like things that we talk about is like, how do we deal with that level of alarm, that level of like thinking, but care for that consistently. Because I mean, there's nothing that anyone can do about me walking outside and being Black. Like that's just gonna be what it is. But like, what is the community care that comes to knowing that that is my reality, right? And like speaking to that openly, and also doing something about that, so that I have the capacity to care for myself, and therefore to care for the community is the aim.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's what she's trying to get to, like the way that we're sold the idea that it's a very individual thing, a very individual process, is antithetical to us building that capacity for all of us. And I think, you know, especially existing in a nonprofit space, like the ability for some of us to be able to access care, rest, a livable wage, right? Like that sometimes is something that also makes us complicit in what the real conditions are. And so like seeing our individual care deeply connected to our care for community and for the collective, I think is something that RJ urges us to do. And
I think it urges us to like be aware of the what's the word we talk about? Like when something is like two-sided, what's the word I'm looking for?
duality.
Like the duality, right? Also the opposition of those sides, right? Like I think RJ like tells us like you have to think about those things.
Yeah.
Because it's like one thing to be in a system and to have to operate in it.
Yeah.
But also like there's feelings that comes with like operating in a system and is it actually helping the bigger mission, but also I need to survive, and also like how do I move through this, right? So it's like the duality and also the opposition of those things have to be talked about.
Right. And then and rooted in that commitment, like what are the values that I'm saying that I believe in? If I say that I'm someone that believes in reproductive justice, and like knowing like based on our visions for reproductive freedom. So what is your vision for that liberated reproductive justice future, right? Since working with RJ will get us there, what is that vision for that?
My vision for that is so large. One, if you're ever around me and she's the same way. We're like, like a lot of our conversations for hours have been like, and we're just like, you know, going off each other. So I think, you know, like for me, the vision of that, one is seeing more folks in this space, right? And folks that are in this space that are not just like people who are impacted negatively by this space. Because like the whole process of like liberation and collective liberation is that it cannot be done just by one group. It also can't be always done by the group that is most impacted. Like that's, again, it just should have point of like, how can I make the growth and the leaps that I want to if I'm also dealing with the things that come with this, right? So I think like that's part of it. And then another part of it is also wanting to see as a collective us caring or finding systems that care for each other as individuals, if that makes sense. So seeing that. And then also, I really want to see, and this is probably going to be kind of weird, but I really want to see, and no, you're going to like this. I want to see, I guess, where it'd be like more democratized or more accessible education. Because I think part of us moving to a more liberated space, a more RJ-based space, is for us to all have the education that we need. Like, I'm doing a lot of thoughts on like, why is all this education locked behind this paywall? Right? And like, why do we not have access to that? And what would happen if we actually did have access to that? Exactly. And so like, that's some of what I want to see. And then the other part is I just want to see people have this space to innovate what we're going to see for the future, right? And I feel like my path and my hope is in this book to build that space and build a part of that path. Because also I know I don't know everything, but I also that I can guide people who do know the things to have more of the space or the systems to support the knowing the things and implementing the things and seeing the things go out into the world. And I can be like, oh yeah, that's the next big thing. Like, how do we all become like people that can help with this mission? Yeah. So it's not a finalized answer, but it's like seeing the future, right? Like what I think about, you know, I'm a woman of a certain age. Not really. I'm like, I'm 34, but it's like, you know, I remember coming into the work at 2015, and like being like, oh, like you know, I was really clear identifying, like finding out a lot of stuff like that I didn't even know. And then I look at the kids that are now in place, right? Like more of the Gen Zers. I say kids, but they're kind of grown, I guess. But
young people.
Yeah, the young people.
I think they prefer to call.
Okay, young people. So like when I see them, right, and they're like their base knowledge is what I had to learn. Right? But then I also see like my kids that are co-parent, like specifically Elijah, who's 11, and his idea of, you know, like I remember growing up and my mom was like, get a job, work there for 30 years, retire, right? And I was like, what you do? And then when I was in the class, I was like, I'm gonna do that. She's like, what are you doing? You know? But like for him, his thought process is like, I'm just gonna work for myself. Like I'm just gonna do my own thing. Like he don't even think about it. He's like, oh, you need a CFO, I'll do it. Like he's like, you know. So I think like when I look at the future, like collective liberation and where I want this book to go is really helping to push that future of like a standard, right? A wider standard, a more liberated standard forward at a faster pace.
And then finally, I wanted to ask about the chapter on healthy communities, because that's super important. And I think especially, you know, I've been thinking a lot about, you know, what does a healthy community look and feel like? I live in South DeKalb, and close to where I live, Atlanta is planning to build a 90-acre police training facility. And they are planning to destroy protected forests, sacred lands, It's, there's been lots of research that implies that this will have implications on Black working class communities surrounding the forest. I live in one of those communities.
Mhm.
Right, so I'm thinking a lot about healthy communities as we've seen more helicopters on our back porch recently, and my baby's just like, what the hell is going on, right?
Mhm.
And so in the title of the chapter, you link healthy communities to healthy parents and healthy babies. Can you talk about that relationship or their arc?
For sure, for sure. So I think one of the things that happens a lot, even like as a doula, right? So someone in a birth situation, like someone's pregnant, they're going through the birth process, and then one of the things that sometimes we all say, I've been guilty of saying too, is like, oh, like if the baby's healthy, everything was good, right? And for anybody who's in this work who's had a child, that's not true. Like the baby can be healthy, right? But the parent can be in dismay. Okay. And so like initially, right, like in that process, like maybe in like actual birthplace, everyone's like, ooh, whatever. But like as a doula, someone who's like, sticking through the process, like if that parent is unhealthy, that generally impacts the baby. Right? No matter if the baby is of the most physical health, right? There's gonna be emotional impacts, there's gonna be all types of learning impacts, there's gonna be all types of things, right? Because the parent is not healthy. Right? But I think also you can't put the onus on the parent of like, why you ain't healthy? You know what I mean? Or go do this, or go do that, or get this quick fix, or whatever the case is, or all these responsibilities. It's like, bro, like they're parenting. Like
Under late stage capitalism.
Yeah, they're going through all levels of grief, they're going through their body changes, their little chemical makeup is different. Like and they're also dealing with everything outside of that, right? That makes up a person. They're just trying to eat. Like they're trying to like drink enough water, right? So it's like, so also like not putting the onus on them, but also thinking more expansively of like, what is the community that they're in? Right? Is the community able to support this parent in their wellness? Right? And so if we don't have a healthy community to support that is resourced, that has options, as simple as can you get to where you gotta go? Right? As simple as can you breathe good air in the time span of that? Right? As simple as like how much is it gonna cost for you to eat, for you to get to where you go, for your kid to be in daycare? Okay. Right? Like also, can you get a job? A good job? Can you get one with benefits? Can you get one that is in close proximity to your space that is more affordable, but now you gotta go how many ever hours away to get to work because that's where the actual money is? Right? So like healthy communities really set up parents for their wellness and therefore impacts their baby. Right? So it's like getting away from the idea that the parent is like singularly responsible for this whole thing and really asking like, what is the community around them?
Yeah, and I think it kind of speaks to like the traditional family, like that's a Western imposition, right? Like we have historically done family and community in ways that allowed for more folks to be taken care of, not just the baby to be taken care of with intentionality. And I think about too, right, when we talk about healthy communities, there's so many examples when you describe like, does the person have a job, right? Like we're in Atlanta, #1 city for income inequality.
Do they have good water to drink?
And then they have
that's right
levels that are acceptable levels of
like it's even before you have the baby, like
right.
What you need to just be
right. Are there grocery stores in your neighborhood? Right.
And what do they have in there?
Right, like when I was pregnant with Jalessah, there was not one. I lived in Pittsburgh, right? A predominantly Black, over-policed neighborhood, right? And so when we talk about healthy communities, right, the backdrop of where we see this like divestment in communities, I think it's important to illuminate the contradictions that we hear around the state's investment in having healthy communities. So I was just thinking about that in relationship to the desire to build this military-style police training facility where they can practice their
because that's also a matter of safety, right? When we talk about having your children, right, reproductive justice, to have children or not have children in safe and sustainable communities, what is your perception of safety? So in your instance, like you're talking about, you may have like quote unquote a nice neighborhood to walk around and take your children, but it's like, but are you gonna feel safe with this big police space like over there?
Right,
Right? And like, but that's not actual safety.
right.
So like that's not also gonna be sustainable if you don't feel safe.
Exactly. But, when we have the Georgia legislature saying things about caring about families, which is, it's part of the justification for some of these abortion bans, which we know are lies, right?
Mhm.
We care about families and children and things of that nature. And, so it's important to illuminate those contradictions and to think about what it actually looks like to invest in healthy communities, because we see that deeply related to a healthy gestational parent,
Yes.
the services that they're able to access.
And the investment into healthy communities is to like what's already there,
Right.
start there, right?
Right.
Like it's not like we come and we bring this thing and like we have these ideas and we like, it's like, no, who's already doing the work in their community
Mhm.
and how do you invest in them
Mhm.
and let them give the directives of what they already know how to do,
Right,
right? So it's also understanding that the people who are there already know what to do
right.
and just help them in the ways that they want to be helped,
Right.
right? And that's how you actually invest into a community.
Yeah. And so how do we build these healthy communities, right? Can RJ guide us in that way?
I think that RJ can guide us, but I think that also goes into kind of like what I would like to see for the future
Mhm.
is that I think the ways that we are often limited in our communities is that it's only the people in the community doing the work.
Mhm.
And there's a reason for that, right? Because we don't trust everybody who's on the outside of it.
And also, just like from a historical perspective, those experiencing the most precarity have always been the ones, because of their material conditions, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's not an incentive oftentimes for other people. This is why class suicide is super important, right?
Mm-hmm.
To deeply align yourself with people who are most impacted, because those who have access, even if it's like not everything that we should have, like, the crumbs of capitalism create the possibility for us to be complacent sometimes, right?
For
And
sure.
so I think one of the things that I want to see is like more RJ practitioners that, are not perhaps worried about if they were going to make rent next month. What does it look like to practice deep solidarity? I like to identify as an RJ practitioner because leader, don't know about what y'all doing.
I know,
Practitioner,
yeah.
practitioner, that means that there's a daily practice, right?
I'm
A lived, you're good, I'm an ad-libber.
Okay.
A live, breathe practice, right? How we be with community, that is something different. So I just.
But I think that's like the part of it, right? Like that's when we're talking about like collective.
Mhm.
That's what that, it can't be just a collective that is being completely like impacted and like like this work, because it's harder to do work when you're on the edge of like, can I survive? Right? It also takes the people who, like you said, they're maybe not struggling with their rent.
Mhm.
They maybe have more capacity, more space, more resource to actually be in the conversation. Right? But it's like,
And I'm saying don't wait for them.
and don't wait for them.
And go build power with the other people that are also experiencing the precarity, because these are the people that are actually like, you know what, we're fed up with this.
And those are also the people that's gonna make some change.
They're the ones with the power. That's
They're
where the
ready to
power
shake
is.
the table.
That's where the power is, in the masses, right? And so, yeah, I think one of the things I like about RJ is that its original articulation in '94, though it wasn't like the comprehensive understanding that we have now, like they spoke specifically to like racial discrimination. They spoke specifically to LGBTQ discrimination. They spoke to class, right? Like there was like a clear.
Sometimes I look at RJ like in that way,
Yeah.
and knowing that it was like 1994,
Yeah.
and I'm like, dang, that was a while ago. And also, it's still speaking to now,
Mhm.
and it's still speaking to the future.
Mhm.
Like looking at all the trans rights right now that are like being taken away, right? All these issues that are coming up, and I'm like, dang, like 1994, they were ahead of their time, like, right? And it's like wild to just see like how much of that information and that thinking and that movement, right, is like you said, more comprehensive now, but also still has so much to grow into.
Yeah, I like to say it needs to be replaced. Because there was a period where there was the push to mainstream RJ, and we know what happens when things are mainstream, right? And so what are we really trying to do? If it's build power, then that's not the goal, right? The goal is to be deeply embedded in this framework and to build power with people who are most impacted by reproductive oppression. But I do want to emphasize there's a possibility in a lane for everybody, right? That's one of the
There's a
things that
lane
we
for
tell.
everybody.
What do you care deeply about? And how can you help people make those connections more salient? I think that's one of the things that feels really important in this moment.
Mhm.
How do we make more salient reproductive justice as a possibility to address the anti-trans repression that we're seeing, to address the gutting of like public school education and the complete removal of history from classrooms, that address the increasing militancy that we see in a way that actually like responds to the level of increased violence that we see, right, in a real way. So
While also like maintaining parts of ourselves.
Right.
Because it's also so easy to get so wrapped in it,
Mhm.
to feel like to just like get to that space of like no return within yourself, right? So for me, it's like when I think about what the future is or what I want the now to be, not even the future, is like I really want people to do this work in a sustainable way. Because many of us, including myself, you get so wrapped up in what's going on that the burnout comes in, and that's longer to recover. You know, that's a longer recovery than anything else.
Right.
So it's like, how do we maintain ourselves while maintaining this work, knowing that the work is always going to be ongoing?
Is the answer in birth?
It's in here.
Yeah.
I think
It's in
that's a
here.
good
It's a little something.
Take a question,
Little teaser.
take a question here, and then we got a question virtually.
Hi, I was wondering how your experience, I know you have a lot of experience with somatic practitioning and somatic experiencing, how that has informed your perspective on collective liberation, and also maybe, I know you're in leadership in that world for a while too, so that maybe is a part of it also from like an organizational structural perspective.
For sure. I have many things about the leadership part. I'm gonna leave that for a different time. But what I will say, the somatic part for me came in after becoming a doula. And so there, I think, you know, you go into it with your own traumas, and like I talk about that in the book, like what was going on with me. And then also doing this work is very traumatic in itself, right? So it's like secondary trauma that is always happening to some extent. But the thing that I was functioning off of was like, I gotta just keep doing the work. I gotta just keep doing the work. And because of that, I wasn't actually feeling anything, right? So my kind of like personal connection to like, what am I doing, or am I doing the work, is very like, what's in front of me, what did I get done, right? And it was never really connected to how I feel. Right. And then when I realized, especially when I had a really, really bad thing, I was doing so much, right? I was in the midwifery school, I was doing this, I was doing that. It was very good on paper, right? And I checked off the points of like, I'm doing this. But my actual feeling was like, I am deeply depressed. Like, and I'm deeply anxious, right? So when I started getting into the somatic part of it, it actually helped me to connect. What is my capacity? Like, what actually feels good to me? Where do I actually belong in this space? And where do I pass off this next thing to someone else who feels good about doing that, right? So it created more sustainability for me, and also allowed me a space to process as I move through, right? Because I think that this work is ongoingly going to be what it is. So how do I process as I move through? How do I make space so that I can keep going, and so that I can do and can meet the goals that I'm aiming to meet? So that was it for me. And then I think kind of unintentionally, my process with that, learning with that, then began to reflect in the things that I did. The way that I teach, the way that I go into spaces, the way that, and then other people were like, oh, this is like mind-body connection is so helpful to helping me understand, and also help me to absorb what's happening, right? So I think that was like my particular mission. So for me, it's not disconnected. Like I can't disconnect it, because it's a very important piece to how I sustain.
So we have a question from our virtual audience. Davina asks, can you explain a little bit about what you mean by birth neoterrorism, I think? which is mentioned in chapter 8 of your book.
Yes. So we talked about this. We've talked about this.
We do.
We have. But you ain't answer it like that though. I just don't work. But we've had conversations around like reproductive justice and also how it's growing and how it's changing and how it's like there's more pieces that's coming into it. And so as I was writing this book, I was like, it's kind of wild. When you write a book, you really get all your thoughts out for the most part. And you never do that any other time. You're kind of always working in pieces. You're like, I do this topic, and then I go over and do this topic, and then I move to this topic, right? But actually seeing like kind of like your brain flow like from start to finish is kind of a wild concept. But it also opens up more space for understanding of what you want to do next or how you feel about different things. So as some of you may know about me, like in the last few years, I have definitely been like doing my For the Village and the ADT, but I also got into the finance world and the investment world and got into all these things that everybody was like, girl, what you doing? Right? That doesn't make sense. It's reproductive justice. Like, why are you over here? And I'm like, because I'm learning what these people are doing with their money. Like, I'm learning where the money is at. I'm learning how it moves because like I didn't have access to that. Right? Growing up, like that was one of those things that was behind the paywall. I'm dead. So my next iteration and like the work that I'm kind of moving into now and the things that I'm building is kind of based in birth terrorism, which the foundation of it is reproductive justice. But it really pulls together this aspect of like the things that are behind the paywall and the things that I haven't had access to and the things I'm aiming to have access to build even more in this world the work that we do.
What is the name of it?
Birth neo-terrorist. So neo-terrorist is someone who loves innovation and novelty.
Okay.
And I put birth in front of it. And I'm like, that's me.
Got it.
Yeah. That's what I think. Because I love a little innovation.
Okay. I've never heard that before.
Because it's me, girl.
Girl,
Girl, don't worry, you're gonna hear more about it. I'm working on stuff.
did you make it up?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because how we gonna create the new for create the new?
Got it. Academics speak of words all the time.
So that's
On that note, folks are gonna have to read the book to get the full.
Yes.
So, we're gonna thank everybody who's watching virtually with us. You can buy Birthing Liberation, How Reproductive Justice Can Set Us Free from Charis by clicking this teal link at the bottom center of your screen. It really does help us when you buy event books from us, so please do that.